Hi everyone, and welcome to Youth on Law, Case in Point, and to our first episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Georgia Wojak, the founder and executive director of Youth on Law, a Minnesota-based 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission at Youth on Law is to address the need for more opportunities for high school students to gain first-hand experience in public service careers. Our mission at Case in Point is to educate and inspire students interested in law by providing insights from legal professionals, discussing current legal issues, and sharing the experience from the youth for the youth. Each episode will be hosted by one of our amazing students on our student board, a partnering law firm, or a guest speaker. Make sure to follow our journey on Instagram at Youth in Law or on our website, youthinlaw.org. We are a fully funded, youth-led nonprofit organization, and your support helps us continue providing legal education and mentorship opportunities to students. If you'd like to donate or sponsor an episode of our podcast, please visit our website or check out the link in our Instagram bio to learn more. And with that, please enjoy the first episode hosted by the Rochester, Minnesota Student Board, Legal Deep Dive, O.J. Simpson versus the People.
Disclaimer: Youth in Law is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The content of this podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not represent any official stance or political affiliation of Youth in Law. Nothing in this episode should be interpreted as legal advice. For legal assistance, please consult a qualified attorney.
To the very first episode of the Youth in Law podcast, where we break down historic and current legal cases from a youth perspective. I'm Danya, and I'm a senior, and I've been a part of Youth in Law for 3 years.
I'm Alicia, and I've been a part of Youth in Law for 2 years.
And I'm Sophia, and I've been a part of Youth in Law for 2 years. Today we're diving into one of the most famous and controversial legal cases in American history, the People versus O.J. Simpson.
We'll break down the facts, the legal strategies, and how the case changed criminal law and media forever. Plus, we'll share our own thoughts along the way. So before we jump in, what do you guys remember first hearing about the case? I know it was before our time, but it's one of those stories that everyone seems to know. So what have you guys heard about it?
What I've heard about it is probably the Dream Team. All I know was that it was the top defense team, and it was famous people. I know I heard about Robert Kardashian, and it kind of just intrigued me. Wow, all these important people involved in this case.
I think the main thing that I remember hearing about was how everyone basically knew that he was guilty, or that they thought he was guilty, but he was never convicted of the murders. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
I remember hearing about all the kind of different details, especially because he was a big star in athletics and also acting, so I know it was a really high profile case. And I also remember hearing about all the kind of components that really brought the kind of defense using racism and stuff like that. So I remember hearing a lot about that.
Let's start with a quick timeline. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman were found brutally murdered outside Nicole's home in Los Angeles.
O.J. Simpson, former NFL star and actor, and Nicole's ex-husband, quickly became the main suspect. What followed was one of the most widely publicized criminal trials in American history.
The infamous slow-speed white Bronco chase happened just 5 days later, with 95 million people watching live. This set the tone for what would become a trial filled with media spectacle and legal drama. Do you guys think that the media helped or hurt the public's understanding of the case? And do you guys look at it the same way today with TikTok and Instagram?
I feel like today we'd look at it a little bit differently on TikTok and Instagram, because people kind of tend to follow the opinion of whoever has the most followers and who has a good credentials. I feel like it would be very different today, but the media kind of helped it in the past, I think.
Something interesting that I learned when I was researching the case is that there were photographers and the media at the crime scene actually when the investigation was happening, and some of the investigators commented on how this changed the way that they were taking the evidence and sort of the way that everything was being processed, because obviously it's a lot different. You're not focused on what's actually in front of you. You're more focused on the fact that there's a camera and there's literally 50 million people watching what you're doing at the at the time. And another interesting point that the defense brought up was that there was some mishandling of the evidence, and since there were so many cameras at the site where they were processing the evidence, they pretty much had evidence of all of this happening. So they had literal pictures of the detectives handling stuff with their bare hands or transferring blood samples or evidence. And so yeah, that was kind of it took away the transparency from what the detectives were doing, and it brought all that into the public eye, which I thought was pretty interesting.
I agree, and I also think kind of that aspect of media helped the legal teams, but at the same time, I feel like, especially with TikTok and Instagram, videographers and photographers are very, like, insensitive, so there's probably stuff that maybe the families wouldn't want released, or, like, photos that are, like, very violent that I think would be on social media, but I think it'd be, like, a very negative thing and, like, really hurt the families of, like, the victim and also the suspect. So I think it would kind of be the same, but maybe more severe now with TikTok and Instagram since everything's on the media.
And especially too, like how I was saying earlier, they took pictures like at the crime scene. The investigators took a blanket from inside of Nicole Simpson's house and they actually covered her body with it, which is obviously like not really what you're supposed to do because it can transfer like fibers, DNA, hair, any of those other things. So like because the media was so present, it kind of caused them to do certain things like that, which weren't typical of how they would investigate a crime scene.
Okay, so talking about kind of the charges and the key evidence, OJ was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution had physical evidence, OJ's blood at the crime scene, blood in his car, and a glove found on his property that matched one found at the scene.
But the defense led by the Dream Team, including Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, and F. Lee Bailey, had a strategy. Shift focus from evidence to reasonable doubt and systemic racism in the LAPD.
One huge moment. LAPD Detective Mark Fuhrman was accused of using racial slurs and possibly planting evidence. That seriously damaged the credibility of the prosecution. Knowing that, what do you guys think? Should the trial have focused more on like the facts of the case, or was exposing bias in the police force just as important?
I feel like exposing the bias in the police force was just as important, just because I know you don't really want to trust someone. I know he had like rumors about him saying the N-word, so it was like, do we really want to be listening to somebody? Like it could have been like a racist crime.
Yes, I would agree. And they actually, like, during his, like, testimony at court, they asked him if he had ever used racial slurs, and he denied that. But there were multiple, like, videos of him and accounts of him using racial slurs, so that kind of took away some of his credibility in the case. And there was a lot of mishandling of evidence, not that it was just his own fault, but there were certain things like the glove, which he found when he was entirely alone, and just other things that kind of pointed him towards tampering of the evidence, but none of that was really ever proven. There is sort of, I guess, a conspiracy that you could call it, that he did tamper with some of the evidence. None of that was ever proven. But I think that the trial did focus on the facts of the case, but most of, like, the stuff that disproved the facts were involved with, like, the way that the police handled the case.
I agree, and I also kind of think at the same time, like, since there was such, like, a focus on exposing the bias in the police force, I feel like maybe, like, Nicole was kind of seen, even though she was the victim and it was, like, about her, she was also kind of seen as, like, a lesser fact of the actual case. Even though it was about her and the whole point was to prove is he guilty or is he not guilty, a lot of it was just kind of worrying about, are they racist towards the suspect? It wasn't really thought about if it was fair to actually her or the actual legal strategies. So I kind of feel like at the same time, it was maybe like too heightened compared to like Nicole and what she went through.
I think it is a big issue as well, like determining whether or not there is like bias in the police force. But I think at the end of the day, it's like it matters more like to get justice. I mean, not matters more, but it's like just as important to get justice for the people who were murdered. And I think that that is kind of like a separate issue, like aside from the murder itself, that like he was racist and he should be like, obviously he should have some kind of
investigation.
Yeah, something like that.
This is where the legal side gets fascinating. The defense's main argument's evidence was contaminated, and OJ was framed by a racist system.
One of the most famous moments, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, referring to the glove OJ tried on in court. It appeared not to fit, and that visual moment stuck with the jury. So I was researching this case, and a crime scene analyst, he like basically tried to recreate this glove scenario. So basically they found one glove on OJ's property and one glove on Nicole's property. And they both appeared to be soaked in blood at the time. So obviously like the evidence was collected, and then the blood dried on the gloves. And then later on in court, they asked him to try on the glove, and it was way too small and he couldn't even put his hand in it. So someone who recreates the crime scene, he tried to like show what happened to the glove, and so he did the same exact thing. He put blood on the identical pair of gloves, and he found that it only shrank 1%, which isn't enough to like change the actual size of it. Like he still would have been able to put it on his hand. So I think that was something really interesting that like added to the layers of the case, because I mean, whose gloves really were they? Because obviously they didn't fit OJ.
I think that's really interesting. And also from like a legal standpoint, this created like a reasonable doubt by discrediting both like the evidence chain and also the people behind it. And remember, like the burden is always on the prosecution. They always have to work harder to prove they have better access usually to evidence. So do you think that the iconic phrase of if it doesn't fit, you must acquit and moments influence the verdict more than the actual evidence? And do you guys think courtroom theatrics outweighed the science?
Personally, I think that the phrase, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, makes sense to me. I feel like it's a really iconic phrase because I don't think, like, without that example in the courtroom, I feel like he would not have been not guilty, just because I feel like it really showed the jury, like, hey, this was possibly planted. So I think that was really enhancing his argument.
I think it was definitely a huge mistake on the prosecution side because they did something that they did like a demonstration and they didn't know the outcome of what would happen. So I think that was just like a major oversight and like, I don't know, honestly kind of stupid, I guess you could say. And I think that definitely discredited what they were saying as well because they seemed so confident like, oh, he's going to try on this glove and it's going to slide right on, fit perfectly. And then he ended up putting it on and it was like obviously way too small. And I think that just discredited all of their like evidence because they were like, oh, we have all of this physical evidence, like it's so obvious. But then they tried this thing on and it was like, wow, like, are you serious? Like, that seems kind of stupid.
I agree, and I also think, I don't necessarily think it was the phrase that made him not guilty. I think a lot of it had to do with that moment in the crime scene analyst and, like, the prosecution not really thinking about the outcome that helped O.J. Simpson get that not guilty verdict.
On October 3rd, 1995, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found O.J. not guilty.
The country was divided. Many Black Americans saw it as a stand against police corruption and racial bias. Others believed it was a miscarriage of justice.
From a legal perspective, the system worked as designed. When there's doubt, the defendant walks. But socially, it sparked massive debates about race, celebrity, and justice in America. So how do we reconcile a correct legal outcome with a moral one that feels wrong to some people? And what definition of justice are we using?
I think, like, the definition of justice that we're using, if there's no, like, concrete evidence that he was guilty, I think that there's always, like, there should be room, like, maybe he was innocent, and I feel like it could feel morally wrong to some people, but at the same time, you don't want to ruin a whole person's life over some conspiracy that he killed his ex-wife, especially if there was, like, a defense team that was helping him and, like, showing all these points saying that he couldn't have done it.
I would agree with you, and I think it is the way that the justice system works, it's not necessarily to be like moral, it's supposed to be like what's factually correct. So in this case, there wasn't fact that he did it, and so he was just therefore like released. And I think that that's just kind of the way that our like justice system inherently works. And it could be argued both ways because in one sense, like if someone's innocent and they're proven guilty because someone morally thinks that that's what should happen, that's not right either. So I think the justice system did do its job, even though it didn't have the moral outcome that some people would want.
I agree, and I also believe that there's so many other cases where a defendant walks and people like disagree, but we only talk about it so much, we only hear about it so much because it's O.J. Simpson, it's this big celebrity case, and because he had money, so people are like, oh, he paid for this, a better defense team, oh, he bribed this person, there's like all these rumors, but I feel like because this isn't like the only time that a defendant walks and people disagree. This is the only one we hear about just because he's a celebrity. So I don't think it's necessarily to say like, oh, justice wasn't served. I agree that it was, but the only reason we feel like it wasn't is because we feel like it affects us or we hear about it even though it doesn't really involve us or we wouldn't have heard about it unless he was a celebrity.
And so now for our takes on the case. Personally, I think this case wasn't just about murder. It was about whether America trusts its justice system. And for many people, the answer is still no.
I agree. The defense team didn't need to prove OJ's innocence, just that the LAPD couldn't be trusted. It was legally smart, but ethically, I think it was murky.
It makes me think about who gets the best defense. With money and fame, OJ could afford the dream team. That's not true for most defendants today.
I think this case showed how powerful legal narratives can be. The facts matter, but so does how you frame them in court. So should everyone get access to a dream team level defense, or should we rethink how public defense works? If you were a juror, how would you have decided based on what you heard so far?
I think that everybody should have access to a dream team level defense, because I feel like whether or not you get like the best lawyers and the best defense team shouldn't matter about like what's in your bank account. I feel like your truth should be heard whether or not you have the money to afford it, especially in when like your life is at stake. And if I were a juror, I would probably have decided that he was not guilty.
So the way that the system works in getting a defense team is that if you're under a certain, I think, like income margin, then you get what's called a public defender, which is someone who's appointed by the state. And they oftentimes have a lot larger caseload than, say, like a private defender or a private defense lawyer. So that can just kind of cause, like, they don't give your case as much attention, and they also don't have as much resources as a private defense lawyer would, because oftentimes they have like private investigators or just other resources at their disposal that are just makes their case stronger. So I think there is definitely a gap there in like wealth, because if you have more money, then you can afford better defense. And I think that definitely causes problems. And if I were a juror, I definitely would have decided not guilty, I think, just based on the fact that you're supposed to find reasonable doubt. And I think that the facts presented caused me to have reasonable doubt that he was guilty of the crime.
I think those are both really good points. I think like thinking about like a dream team, especially in this case, we kind of have to think about, okay, all these lawyers are obviously very good and they have very good records. However, what made them win obviously was a lot of luck, honestly, because there was so much media presence and so much like videography and photography. There was so much like availability for them to prove their point, and also kind of because of the investigator who had these like racial component as a part of it, I think it made it easier for them to do their job. So I don't necessarily think that just because they had good records or they had a lot of money, or just because O.J. Simpson had a lot of money, that makes them like the dream team. I think they had a lot of luck in this case. I do think it's not necessarily fair just because if you're in a certain income to have access to certain attorneys and certain lawyers. And I especially think we're talking about the caseload, right? So it's like, I think it should be split more evenly, and also think about like how much an attorney, especially like a public defender, how much they have to focus on and how much they have to work. So I think everyone should have access to a dream team. However, I wouldn't necessarily call this team a dream team. And if I were a juror, as much as like internally I want to say, oh, I would have found him guilty, I think if I was a juror, I'd have to be, subjective, and also think about like not thinking about the media or like the past claims of his violence. I probably would have found him not guilty just because of the lack of evidence proving his guilt.
In the dream world, everybody wants great representation in the ideal dream team, but sadly this is not plausible. So how can we fix this issue?
So I did a mentorship with a local private law firm, and something that they did, which I thought was really cool, was that they were part-time public defenders. The majority of their caseload is private, but when the public defense office would have sort of an overload of cases, they would take on some of those extra cases just to provide additional resources. And so while the public defender is doing great with what they have and what they do specifically, it would be ideal if we could have more private defenders doing this sort of part-time role where they help the public defense office when needed.
And with like the workload of the public defender's office, there's limited to more resources, and they do great in what they have. Private defenders just have more available resources to them.
I agree with both of those. I totally think that obviously like public defenders should be very well credited because they work really hard, and also it's not necessarily like their fault that they don't have as much resources. So I think this is a really good solution to make sure that everyone gets the representation they deserve.
In 1997, O.J. was found liable in a civil court for the wrongful deaths of Nicole and Ron. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million to their families.
Civil cases have a lower burden of proof, preponderance of evidence instead of beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's a certain threshold. In a criminal trial, you have the jury, which is 12 jurors, and the vote has to be unanimous. So every single person is they all agree with the decision that they come to, and their threshold is beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's 90 to 100% sure that their conclusion is correct. However, in a civil trial, there are 12 jurors, but only 9 need to be in favor, so already it's a lower threshold. And the standard of proof is what's called preponderance of evidence, which means more than 50% likely. So that doesn't mean entirely convinced, it just means more likely than not.
Alright, the legacy of this case still lives on. It led to changes in how DNA evidence is handled, how jury selection works, and how media can shape a trial before it even begins. What's your biggest takeaway from the case? It's about law, race, media, or something else entirely?
Personally, I think it's about race. Today, I feel like a lot of people feel like their opinion has to be based on what race they are or what their identity is. And this really ties into identity politics, which is the use of shared characteristics to fight for a political or social justice belief, which kind of relates to this case today, because I feel like the more entrenched you become in your identity, the harder it becomes to find common ground. And in a case like this, it's kind of like only two right opinions and like really two opposing parties, so it kind of becomes dangerous because it's like everybody's against another, like us versus them.
I think the case is mostly about law because, and media, because I think something that really affected the trajectory was how involved the media was. So like, for example, the cameras being in the courtroom the entire time, I think really changed how, I guess, some of the evidence was presented. Like, was it more they were doing this for show, or were they doing this for like the jury? And I think that also changed the way that the lawyers sort of interacted with the evidence in the jury, because obviously they're more under pressure and they're like, oh, like I'm being filmed, like millions of people are watching this, instead of just thinking, okay, this is my job, this is what I'm trying to, like, this is the message I'm trying to convey. And like we were talking about earlier, I think that it was sort of invasive the way that the media was like penetrating the crime scene, and I think that that is definitely a lesson learned for the future, because, and the handling of evidence as well, because that just kind of can be repeated, because obviously it led to a supposedly guilty man walking free, and it just kind of tainted the whole justice system and established how they weren't credible. And another interesting thing that I think came from this case was the establishment of DNA evidence, because before this time it was mostly just like you could tell if the blood type was like O positive, O negative, like any of that type of thing. But after this case they started to use like DNA so they could tell whose blood it actually was. So yeah, I think that kind of is an interesting thing on more of the forensics side. And I also thought that it was interesting how this went from the criminal case to a civil case, because even though the families didn't get justice in the criminal case, they brought it to the civil case, which then they got justice. And there were some important tactics used during the civil case, like the process of impeachment. So before they actually went to the civil trial, there was a deposition. So basically they like questioned/interrogated O.J. Simpson, and they established how he was lying about multiple things. Like, he was lying about the abuse of Nicole, he was lying about the shoes that he was wearing at the crime scene, which matched up with the footprints, and all of these things. So I think that was an interesting legal tactic that was sort of publicized after this case.
I agree with that completely, and I also think for me one of the biggest takeaways was media. And if we think about when this case was, it was like 94, 95, so like the mid-90s, and we're about like 30 years past that point. And like media, this was kind of a big step forward for like media in the courtrooms. Like there's plenty of cases that have happened more recently, like George Floyd, like Brian Koberger, and like also currently like when the P. Diddy trial just finished up. So like all these different trials, they use a lot of like media. But I think that the kind of having media as a part of the trial actually did help with the verdict, not guilty or guilty, because like the media notices all these different things. And like even now with like the most recent like Diddy trial, or like Sean Combs is his name, so with that trial there was a lot of, they had to redo jury selection so many times because the media would like notice something about a juror and do an extensive background research and post an article about it, and they're like, oh, we have to redo jury selection. Or there's times where even the defendants, like not just Sean Combs, but like numerous defendants have learned how to use media to get what they want. So like it's also like kind of now like media safety is also at risk. Like at the time of this trial, of O.J. Simpson trial, I feel like maybe it was more like the families that were at risk, or the media is being invasive and like all this other stuff. But now I feel like the media is also at risk, especially with celebrities. Like, oh, they're being noticed, and defendants are saying, oh, like, I know you, or like, I think that like that person has to be leaving the courtroom. So I think it like makes the cases like longer, and I think makes the trials a lot longer and also a lot more like intricate, and you have to pay attention to everything. So like that's kind of like what I took away the most, was kind of the aspect of media, and also kind of how media brought in all these different perspectives. Now we all know everything about everyone's lawyer, about every single jury, about all their family members, and it's hard to, especially when you're a lawyer, like be very like objective and like ignore everything that you see, because it's everywhere now. And I think this was like the case that really like turned around kind of law and like really brought in media towards it. No one really thought about it until this time, especially because he was such a big celebrity and he still is, and he still has so many supporters and so many interviewers doing articles on him. And like that just like I think was like a really good lesson for everyone who works in the system. But I also don't think that this case needed to be a lesson. I think it's kind of sad that it had to be like so trial and error and so, I mean that's like funny wording, but like so you don't actually like they don't actually know what's happening, the evidence is false, the media is taking photos of the body, all this kind of stuff. I think it was sad what happened, and that's kind of what I noticed the most.
I think your point was interesting, how you said that the media can sometimes help the case, because I noticed that in the civil trial for O.J. Simpson, because there was this whole question about the shoes that O.J. Simpson was wearing, and because there was a pretty obvious clear trail of like bloody footprints going away from the bodies, and they knew exactly like what kind of shoe it was, and it was like this very expensive, like unique brand of Italian leather shoes. Like it wasn't like an Air Jordan or something that like most people would have access to. And during his deposition, Simpson actually testified, he was like, I quote, "I would never wear those ugly shoes," which is kind of crazy because that was just an entire lie, because later on during the civil trial, an article came out which featured a photograph of O.J. Simpson actually wearing those exact shoes. And then Nicole's family and Ron's family, their lawyer, dug more into this, and he contacted the photographers to get like the photos of him wearing the shoes, and it turned out there were like a plethora of them, so it was very obvious that he did in fact own this certain pair of shoes that was very like specific. So I think that use of the media was an interesting addition to the case.
Thanks for joining us for episode 1 of the Youth and Law Case in Point podcast. The O.J. Simpson case is still talked about because it forces us to ask big questions about law, race, power, and justice.
If you like this episode, follow us on Instagram at Youth and Law and check out our website youthandlaw.org to learn more about our work.
And stay tuned for next month's episode, where we'll dive into another case that shaped American legal history. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.
And that's Case in Point.